Hi, my name is Sarah Smith, and I am about to give a presentation on the road to the Revolution. This is the beginning stages of the American Revolution and what led up with the split with Britain. After 1660, a lot of things changed in the colonies. People in the colonies were still Englishmen, but they started to feel like they were not a part of Britain. There were a lot of things that happened that made the colonists decide to break off. The three that I have stated on this slide are, first, the British tried to get money from the colonies. Second, the French and Indian War gave American colonists military experience and unity. And there were also different concepts of representation. I will be going into each one of these more deeply. The Navigation Acts. One way that the British tried to make money from the colonies was through the Navigation Acts. They were used to restrict trade and bring trade to Britain. The first part of the act said that all imperial trade has to be put on British-owned ships. Imperial trade would be a product that is traded to benefit the British country. Next, all enumerated goods have to be sold in England. Enumerated goods would be like lumber or other expensive products. This means that the colonies could not sell their goods to other countries and that it has to go through England first. Finally, there were also taxes on different products like sugar and molasses. These products were used a lot in the colonies, so the colonists had to pay a lot of money in taxes for them. The French and Indian War. During this time period, the British were involved in a lot of European wars, especially with France. Eventually, the fighting gets brought back to America with the French and Indian War. This is also known as the 7 Years' War. As you can probably tell from the second name, it lasted 7 years, between 1754 to 1763. The French and Native Americans teamed up against the British. This war did not help with tensions between the colonies and Britain. It actually added a lot of tension. The first way that it increased tension was that the British Navy was impressing colonists into the British Navy. Impressing means that they would kidnap the colonists and force them to be in the Navy. The British had over 10,000 ships and had really no contact with the colonists. The second reason was that it gave the colonists military experience. This led to the rise of George Washington. At first, he led a bad attempt at taking the French, but it let his name get out there for the public to see, this young officer who would make a huge impact in the Revolution. Another reason for tension was because of the Proclamation Line of 1763. This said that no one could settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered colonists because they had just gotten a lot of land, and they should be able to do what they want with it. Finally, money always seems to be a topic of discussion. Wars cost a lot of money, and so there was a lot of debt. It resulted in a lot of economic chaos and depression. Representation. So everyone has heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. But what does it really mean? Well, the colonies did not have much representation in the British government. This raised the question, why should they be helping the British monarch with money from taxes, when they have no say in the actual government itself? The British had what it was called a virtual representation. Virtual representation is where a member is elected to Parliament, and they are not only in charge of the district they are from, but the entire empire. The colonies did not want this, however. They wanted direct representation, and this is where they vote for someone to vote for them in the government. Acting out. Most people that were angry with the government were people on the lower part of the class levels. It was the lower class that was affected the most, so they were the ones that acted out the most. They formed several crowds, which was an orderly protest against the law. One thing that gave the colonists something to protest about was the Stamp Act. This is a tax on all printed goods, so this angered the middle class as well. This is where Sam Adams comes into play. He organized that everyone protest in a crowd in Boston. It ended very well and seemed successful without using any violence. Then, without Sam Adams, there was another protest, but this one became violent quickly. After the violent riot over the Stamp Act, John Adams, who is pictured on the right, decides to start a group called the Sons of Liberty. It catches word pretty quickly and spreads a lot to the major cities. This group not only had the lower class in it, but it was a mix of the middle class too. This was the first real time that there was a cross-class organization. They were against all restrictions that the British were holding against them. They used petitions and boycotts to get their point across. The Stamp Act only lasted a year, from 1765 to 1766. The Stamp Act was a way of getting money and the country was still in debt, so the British government decided to put in the Townshend Acts. This was a tax on goods like tea and glass. The colonists did not act too well to this act, and so a lot of violent protests started. It also started a protest called the Boston Massacre. This event that was triggered, the Boston Massacre, was dealing with a rope factory. People had to fight for their jobs because there really was not much of them out there. There were a lot of British soldiers moonlighting, which means they were trying to find jobs because they weren't fighting. A rope company offers them a job to clean the ship houses. This angered colonists, and so they created a crowd where the soldiers were being quartered. Quartered means that the American citizens were housing the soldiers for the time being. The colonists grabbed snowballs, rocks, sticks, and really anything they could grab a hold of, and start throwing them at the soldiers. Then, one of the soldiers accidentally fires into the crowd. No one was ordered to shoot, but because of one shot, the rest of the soldiers started shooting as well. They thought they might have missed an order or something. 5 colonists were killed overall. Here is a picture of the Boston Massacre. You can see how biased the picture is compared to what really happened. It makes it look like the colonists were completely innocent and unarmed, while the British just started shooting out into the crowd. This was used as propaganda tool for colonists to fight against the British. At the time, there was still a tax on tea. This angered colonists because a lot of people drank tea. The water was not good enough to drink, so that is all they could really drink. In 1773, the Sons of Liberty gathered together and went to the Boston Harbor and dumped tea off of the ships. Here is a picture of the Sons of Liberty dumping tea off the ship into the Boston Harbor. The Intolerable Acts. The British did not like how the colonists were responding to different acts, so they put in the Intolerable Acts. The main one was the closing of the Boston port in 1776. Secondly, there was a Massachusetts Government Act that said all officials in the colonies were to be appointed by the king or the governor. The colonists had no say who was running their colonies. Then there was the Administration of Justice Act. This allowed the governors to postpone or move trials for British officers, so they could get out of what crime they were in. They could even be tried in Britain if they wanted to. Next was the Quartering Act. This meant that civilians had to house British troops no matter what. Finally, it changed the boundaries of the Quebec territory so that Quebec was larger. The Continental Congress. The colonies are angry about the Intolerable Acts, and so they all get together and boycott all British goods. To make sure that everyone was following this, they made a group called Committees of Observation. These people would go out and make sure that people were doing what they were supposed to be doing with the boycott. Then they got a bunch of people together to have a militia. A militia is a small army. Then the Second Continental Congress meets. This time, George Washington leads it, and they talk about what the next steps with the British are going to be. Common Sense. Thomas Paine, who is pictured on the right, wrote a document called Common Sense. It had a strong argument fighting for independence against Britain. He said that America had the resources and they should be able to run their own country without the British. He also suggests a new form of government. He said a monarchy would not work because someone that is 3,000 miles away should not rule the colonies. Unified or not? The real question is if all Americans were against the British, and they were not. Majority of Americans were not in favor of it. 2/5 or 40% were patriots. This means they were against the British. 1/5 or 20% were loyalists or loyal to the British government. These tended to be the rich or the wealthy. 2/5 or 40% were neutral, or they just did not care. There was a lot of fighting because there were areas with majority of one group or another. All of my information is from History 111 class at Central Michigan University. Here's some information if you have questions or on any information that I stated. Thanks, Professor Jennifer Green, for your lectures.